Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
They were crying outside the glass door of my new office building, looking like they'd seen a ghost. And honestly, I kinda hoped they had. But before that moment, before the tears, before I walked away, before they finally realized something was broken beyond repair, there was a folding chair in the front row of my graduation ceremony with my name taped to the back of it, and two empty seats beside it that were supposed to be filled by the people who made me. It was my second graduation. The first one they missed, they had a somewhat decent excuse. I was just getting my associate's degree from community college, and my sister had a national dance competition in another state. They promised me they'd make it up to me. I believed them. I actually believed them. This time, it was my bachelor's. 4 years of late-night study sessions, working 2 part-time jobs, and barely sleeping. I had done everything right. I didn't party, I didn't slack off, I didn't even date. I just wanted to prove that I was worthy of their attention, worthy of their time. I was finally graduating from the University of Wisconsin, and all I asked was that they show up, sit in those hard metal chairs for one afternoon, and clap when they called my name. They said they'd be there. My mom texted me the night before, "So proud of you, we're hitting the road by 8." And my dad followed up with a thumbs up emoji and a "love you, kiddo." I didn't sleep that night. I laid my cap and gown across the chair in my apartment like a kid leaving cookies out for Santa. The next morning, I kept looking at my phone while getting dressed. No texts, no "we're here," no "parking was a nightmare," just silence. As I walked across the quad toward the stadium, my stomach felt like it was in knots, but I told myself they were probably just running late. It was a 6-hour drive, maybe traffic, maybe a flat tire, maybe anything but what I already suspected. The ceremony started, the rows began to fill. There were dads adjusting camera tripods, moms holding tightly to bouquets, and grandparents wearing big sunglasses and sun hats. My 2 empty seats stood out like missing teeth. People noticed. The girl next to me leaned over and asked if they were coming. I just smiled and nodded. "They'll be here soon," I said, and swallowed down the part of me that knew better. They never came. They didn't call. They didn't text. When they called my name and I walked across the stage, all I could hear was the clapping of strangers. I smiled for the camera, held up my fake diploma, and scanned the crowd like an idiot. Like maybe they had slipped in late and were hiding in the back. But there was no one. Later that evening, I got the text. My mom sent me a photo. Rebecca in a sparkly red costume, mid-pose with the caption, "Our little star, tonight's performance was unforgettable." That's when I realized. They'd known all along. There was no conflict. There was no mistake. They just picked her. Again. I didn't reply. I sat on my bed in my little off-campus apartment, still in my gown, the safety pins digging into my skin, my phone in my hand, and I let that silence stretch. For hours. I think that's when something shifted inside me, something quiet and permanent. My roommate Kayla came home later that night with champagne and fast food, and we celebrated together. She was trying, she really was, but I was somewhere else, watching all the versions of myself that had tried to be good enough slowly disappear, one by one. That night, after she went to bed, I did something I'd never done before. I opened Google Maps and typed in cities to move to after college. I wasn't looking for a job. I wasn't looking for a fresh start. I was looking for a place where nobody would know I was someone's second choice. I remembered this trip I took in high school, a journalism competition in Denver. The air felt clearer there. I remembered a diner with pie so good it made me cry. So I clicked on a Craigslist ad for a roommate in Capitol Hill and sent a message before I could second-guess myself. The next day, I changed my number. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't tell them I was leaving. I left my cap and gown on the curb with a free sign and drove to a town 3 states away with whatever fit in the back of my used Honda. No goodbye note, no dramatic confrontation, just silence, stretched long and unforgiving. I blocked their numbers. I blocked my sister. I didn't unfriend them. Just left it so they could still see me, if they wanted to look hard enough. let them wonder, let them stew. What I didn't expect, not even in my darkest, most self-righteous fantasies, was that a month later, they'd actually show up, crying at my job in Denver. But I'll get to that, because this was just the beginning. There's a strange kind of quiet that settles in when you move somewhere new where no one knows your name, your history, or the shape of your emotional bruises. And for the first time in a long time, that silence felt less like loneliness and more like possibility. I arrived in Denver with little more than 3 suitcases, a car that had a cracked windshield and a suspicious rattle in the engine, and an address scribbled on a coffee-stained notepad that I'd found in my glove box at a gas station halfway through Nebraska. The apartment was older, the building creaked at night, and the carpet looked like it had seen one too many college parties. But it was mine, or at least half mine, because I was splitting it with a woman named Melissa, who worked nights as a bartender and, to her credit, didn't ask any questions when I told her I didn't talk to my family and didn't plan to. My new job came almost immediately, not because I was lucky, but because I had spent the previous 6 months before graduation applying to anything that looked vaguely tolerable in cities I liked the sound of. I landed a role as a junior public relations assistant for a small but scrappy firm that specialized in tech startups, run by a 50-something man named Mr. Dennis, who had a coffee addiction and an eye for people who didn't quite fit into boxes. I showed up to work wearing an ill-fitting blazer and shoes that hurt after 20 minutes. And within the first week, I was already rewriting bios for self-important CEOs who wanted to sound like Steve Jobs without actually doing anything revolutionary. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid rent, and it gave me a desk with a nameplate and a reason to get out of bed in the morning that didn't include wondering why I was never the one chosen. In those early weeks, I kept things simple. I went to work, I came home, I learned how to navigate a city full of people who smiled too much in grocery stores and didn't seem to be in a rush to get anywhere. I changed my last name on social media to my mother's maiden name, something no one would think to search, and I started making small choices that felt like I was shedding skin. I dyed my hair darker, stopped checking my old hometown's Facebook pages, and set my phone to silent unless I was expecting a call, which was rare. I hadn't unblocked anyone. I hadn't spoken a single word to anyone from my past, not even Kayla, who texted me once to say she missed me, but understood. But silence isn't the same as healing. There's this idea that if you cut off the people who hurt you, the wounds will close up on their own. But I learned pretty quickly that the ghost of a childhood built on second-place ribbons and ignored report cards don't leave just because you crossed state lines. The resentment followed me like a shadow, low and steady, and some nights I found myself scrolling through my old messages. Not to reply, but just to remind myself that I wasn't making it up. That the proof was right there, in text that said, "Can you be a little understanding? Rebecca's under a lot of pressure, and we're so proud of you, just in different ways." What the hell does that even mean? Different ways? I used to read that and imagine someone clapping at a funeral. I wasn't alone for long, though. About 3 weeks into the job, I started getting paired with a coworker named Jonah for client calls and pitch meetings. He had a way of talking that made people relax without even realizing it. And while he wore suits that were clearly too expensive for his job title, he never once made me feel small, which was rare. He was the kind of guy who noticed when you were quiet for too long and didn't try to fill the silence, just waited until you were ready to talk. We started having lunch together, then coffee breaks, then Friday nights where we accidentally bumped into each other at the same dive bar around the corner from the office. I liked him, I really did, but I didn't let it go too deep because there was this part of me, call it pride or trauma or survival instinct, that couldn't bring itself to let anyone into the mess. I hadn't even started to clean up yet. It was around that time that I got the first digital knock on my door. A message request on an old email account I hadn't used in years, from a sender that wasn't saved in my contacts, but had a subject line that froze the blood in my veins. "Please come home, it's important." It was from my father's email address, not a number, not a voicemail, not a guilt-tripping group text. Just 6 words, no explanation, no punctuation. I stared at it for almost an hour before closing the tab without opening the message. I didn't delete it. I just left it there, floating in inbox limbo, unread and unanswered. But it haunted me. Not because I missed them, not because I was ready to forgive anything, but because I knew my father didn't write emails unless it was something serious. He was the kind of man who sent chain texts and copied links from Facebook, not someone who opened up a Gmail account and typed out vague pleas. I told myself not to think about it, to keep moving forward, to stay in the version of my life where I was finally the main character, not the understudy. But that's the thing about families. They know exactly where your weaknesses are because they're the ones who helped build them. I didn't reply, but I did something worse. I opened a new browser window and typed in the name of Rebecca's dance studio, the same one my parents had supposedly gone to instead of attending my graduation. It took less than 5 minutes to find out what I was already starting to suspect. There hadn't been a recital that weekend. There hadn't been anything scheduled at all. The studio's Facebook page, complete with glittery headers and poorly cropped photos, showed their end-of-season performance had been canceled 2 weeks prior due to a leaky roof. There were apology posts, promises of a rescheduled showcase in July, and even a video of Rebecca helping tape down stage corners during repairs. They had lied. Not just forgotten, not just misunderstood, lied. And the lie wasn't just about choosing her over me. It was about the fact that they didn't even think I was worth the truth. That night, I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I didn't even call Kayla, though part of me wanted to. I just sat at my desk in the corner of the apartment, opened a blank Google Doc, and started making a list of things I'd always assumed were accidents, but now saw in brutal clarity. The missed birthdays, the way my science fair trophies always ended up in the basement, the time my mom forgot to pick me up after soccer practice because Rebecca had an extra rehearsal. I didn't know it yet, but that list would become my blueprint. Not for forgiveness, but for revenge. Quiet, precise, measured. The kind of revenge that doesn't yell or burn bridges. The kind that builds a new life so solid and untouchable that when they come looking, all they find is a locked door and the echo of everything they chose not to see. And the next thing I planned was going to make them look very closely. There is something especially cruel about the kind of lie that isn't just careless or emotional, but rather deliberately constructed with the exact knowledge of how much it will sting once the truth is finally uncovered. And what made it worse was the fact that it hadn't even been necessary, because they could have simply told me they didn't want to come. They could have said the truth straight to my face, that I would never be the priority, that their loyalty had always belonged to someone else. Someone younger, more graceful, shinier in their eyes, and that my accomplishments were always going to be less important than the next time Rebecca tied on her point shoes and twirled on a stage under soft lights and polite applause. It wasn't just about the missed graduation anymore. It was about what that lie represented. How small they must think of me to assume I'd accept something so flimsy without digging deeper. I couldn't stop myself once I had seen the studio's Facebook page, with its cheery post about the canceled recital and their apologies for any inconvenience, including a video of Rebecca in jeans and a paint-smeared hoodie helping mop water from a buckled floor instead of performing in sequins. The recital didn't just get rescheduled. It never existed in the first place during my graduation weekend. My parents had chosen not to show up for me, and instead of admitting that decision, they gave me a glitter-covered excuse and expected me to swallow it whole. So I did what any quietly enraged daughter who had spent her entire childhood pretending disappointment didn't hurt might do. I decided that if they were going to treat me like a footnote in their story, I would edit them out of mind completely, not with screaming matches or ultimatums, but with strategy and silence. It wasn't about vengeance, not really, not at first. It was about control. About reclaiming something that had been slowly taken from me in pieces over decades. My right to matter, my right to decide when enough was enough, my right to be the narrator of my own life without waiting for them to finally hand me a line worth speaking. I started small. A burner email address, a throwaway Gmail created with an alias that sounded just plausible enough to pass for a real person. Then I found the contact information for the real estate company that managed their rental home back in Racine. The same tan house with the creaky porch swing and overgrown hydrangeas, where I had spent 14 years learning to shrink myself. I emailed as Emily Sorensen, said I was relocating from Minneapolis for a medical job, and had been looking into listings in that neighborhood. I asked if the property at their address might be available for sale soon, that I'd seen it on a list of upcoming owner move-outs. I knew they hadn't planned to move, of course. That was the point. A week later, I got a reply. The property manager said the owners hadn't mentioned moving out, but they would forward my inquiry to the tenants in case they were considering a lease termination or sublet. That was all I needed. 2 days after that, my mother posted something vague on Facebook. Anyone know of any good moving companies that don't cost an arm and a leg? Just exploring options. No comments, no likes. I waited. I didn't reach out. I just sat in my Denver apartment with the windows open and the sound of the streetcar rolling past, drinking coffee from a chipped mug, and wondering if they were nervous, if they were arguing in their kitchen, if my dad was blaming the HOA or the mailman or the economy for the sudden inquiry. I kept feeding the illusion. Another email from Emily, this time asking if she could schedule a walkthrough to assess the layout in case it came on the market next month. The agent agreed to pass the message along again, but nothing was confirmed. I knew my parents well enough to know what was happening behind the scenes. Panic disguised as control. My mom was probably sifting through bank records to calculate how much a sudden move would cost, while my dad paced the living room with his hands in his pockets, repeating the same question. Why would anyone want this house? And while they stewed, I took things one step further. I printed a photo of my graduation gown, folded and draped across my dorm chair before the ceremony, the one no one showed up for. I walked it down to the dumpster behind my building, crumpled it slightly, and took a new photo, this time from above, as if someone had discarded it like trash. Then I texted that picture from another burner number to my mother's phone. No name, no message, no context, just the image. Just a quiet, still life version of everything I had wanted to say for years. This is what you did. This is what you threw away. She never replied, but I saw the status go from delivered to read. I pictured her sitting at the kitchen table, phone in her hand, her face tight with confusion, maybe even guilt, though I doubted that. She wasn't the kind to question her decisions, just to panic when the consequences showed up uninvited. I waited for a call. Nothing came. I went to work the next day, finished a report on a software launch, grabbed lunch with Jonah, and told him I was just catching up on sleep. He didn't press. That was the thing about him. He knew not to push unless I opened the door myself. That night, I lit a candle, opened my old journal, and wrote down everything I remembered from the last time they had shown up for me unprompted. I couldn't think of a single moment, not one. Birthdays were always bundled with Rebecca's recitals. Holidays were centered around her travel schedule. Even my college acceptances had been met with, "That's great, but how are we going to get Rebecca to nationals with those dates?" This wasn't new. It was just finally undeniable. I don't think I'd planned what came next until it happened. But once I realized the pattern, once I saw how deep the favoritism had dug its roots, I decided to sever the last remaining ties in the most brutal way I could, by becoming completely unreachable, except when I wanted to be found. I booked a trip back to Racine under a different name, stayed 2 nights in a cheap hotel, walked past my old house wearing sunglasses and a hoodie. I saw them in the yard, my dad trimming the hedge that had always been overgrown, my mom talking on the phone with her other hand shielding her eyes from the sun. I didn't speak to them. I didn't wave. I just stood behind a tree across the street and watched the people who had taught me how to disappear continue living like nothing had changed. And in that moment, I realized something that surprised me more than any of the lies, more than the graduation, more than all of it. I didn't miss them, not even a little. What I missed was the version of them I had made up in my head, and that version, she was long gone. It was a Tuesday like any other, the kind of weekday that blurs into the next, with the quiet predictability of routine. A lukewarm mug of black coffee on my desk, emails blinking for attention, the soft click of keyboards filling the open plan office like a mechanical lullaby. Until my boss, Mr. Dennis, stepped out of his office with a strange look on his face, a tight combination of concern and curiosity that immediately made my stomach twist with unease, because he never left his office unless something was wrong, or unless he wanted to complain about the temperature in the building again. He leaned against my cubicle wall in that easy way middle-aged men in management tend to do when they think they're softening the blow, and asked if he could speak with me privately, his tone so casual it only heightened my anxiety. I followed him, heart beginning to pound in a way I hadn't felt in months, maybe longer, and the second he closed the glass door behind us and gestured toward the small couch in the corner of his office, I knew something was off. Something big and unwelcome and deeply personal. He sat across from me, exhaled a slow breath, and said with the kind of reluctant empathy that told me he was just the messenger, "There's a couple downstairs asking to see you. They say they're your parents." It didn't register at first, or maybe I refused to let it register, because the idea that they would show up here, in Denver, at my workplace of all places, without warning, without invitation, felt so absurd that my mind immediately defaulted to denial. I remember blinking at him, trying to process what he had just said, and then asking far too calmly, "What do they look like?" As if I didn't already know the answer, as if I hadn't memorized every inch of their faces through a lifetime of reluctant glances and forced family photos. Mr. Dennis, bless him, described them with awkward precision. A woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and too much makeup. A man with a baseball cap pulled low and hands that wouldn't stop fidgeting. I stood up before he could finish, thanked him stiffly, and walked out without another word, the weight of dread settling across my shoulders like a winter coat soaked through with icy rain. I took the elevator down to the lobby with my jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack. And when the doors opened with a soft ding, I saw them immediately, standing by the security desk, huddled together in a way that made them look both out of place and strangely vulnerable, like two aging strangers who had wandered too far from home and weren't quite sure how to find their way back. My mother's face was streaked with tears, her hands twisting the strap of her purse, while my father looked pale and uncomfortable, as though the very act of standing in this space, surrounded by glass and marble and strangers, was physically painful. They looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, and for a brief, fleeting second, I felt something like pity crawl up the back of my throat. Before I swallowed it down and reminded myself exactly why I was here, why they weren't supposed to be. They saw me, and my mother's face crumpled in that instant, as if the mere sight of me broke whatever dam she'd been holding up inside herself. And she rushed toward me with outstretched arms, crying, "Natalie, please, we didn't know how else to reach you. We didn't know what to do. We just need to talk." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just looked at her, at both of them, with the kind of cold detachment I never thought I'd be capable of. And in that stillness, I saw something shift in my father's face. An acknowledgement, maybe, or a recognition that whatever apology they had come to deliver wasn't going to be accepted easily, if at all. I finally spoke, my voice steady but low, and asked, "What are you doing here?" My mother started talking before my sentence had even finished, the words tumbling out like water from a broken pipe. "Rebecca's been in an accident, the car flipped, she's in the hospital, it's bad, she's asking for you. We didn't know how to find you, we're so sorry, we're so sorry." My father added nothing, just nodded along, eyes glassy, lips tight. The phrase, "she's asking for you," hit me in the chest like a slow, deliberate punch. And yet I couldn't quite make sense of it. Why would Rebecca, the same sister who never once defended me, never once stepped in when our parents overlooked me, the same girl who existed at the center of their universe while I spun in orbit, suddenly want me? I said nothing for a long time, just let their words hang in the sterile air between us while people walked past, casting sideways glances, probably assuming some dramatic family reunion was unfolding before their eyes. And then finally I responded, not with anger, not with an outburst, but with a calm, surgical cruelty that only years of emotional restraint can foster. "You didn't come to my graduation," I said, and watched their faces shift with discomfort. Watch the guilt rise like steam. "You lied about why, and now you want to stand here and pretend like that was just a mistake? Just another oversight?" My mother opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. "Don't. I know there was no recital. I know everything." The silence that followed was deafening. My father lowered his gaze. My mother stammered something about not knowing what else to say, about being afraid, about making mistakes. I let her finish. Then I looked them both in the eyes and said, "You didn't come when I needed you. Don't expect me to run when you do." And I turned around, just like that. I walked out of the building, past the cafe where Jonah and I usually got lunch, walked until my feet hurt and my lungs burned, walked until the sound of my mother's voice faded from my memory, replaced by the steady rhythm of my own breath and the click of my heels on concrete. When I got home, I dug out the old shoebox I kept hidden in the back of my closet, the one filled with letters I had written to them over the years, every birthday they forgot, every time they chose her over me, every apology I never got. I read one, just one. Then I took the whole box down to the alley behind my apartment and set it on fire in a metal trash can. Watched the edges curl and blacken. Watched years of grief turn to ash. They had found me. After all that silence, they had finally come looking. But I wasn't the same girl they left behind. And I wasn't sure I wanted to be found. There's something strangely sobering about the moment you realize that closure. The kind you've convinced yourself is waiting just around the next phone call, the next sit-down, the next tearful explanation, isn't something that's given or even earned, but rather something you have to take for yourself, often without the neat emotional packaging you spent your whole life hoping for, and never with the clarity or fairness you imagined it would come with. After that encounter in the lobby of my office, the one where my parents stood under fluorescent lighting with trembling hands and bloodshot eyes, I thought for a long time that I'd said everything that needed saying, that my silence had been definitive, that walking away had been my final word. But the problem with years of being overlooked is that the part of you trained to seek validation doesn't die quietly. It lingers, it whispers, it plays devil's advocate when you're trying to sleep. Jonah noticed the change in me almost immediately because despite everything I kept bottled up, he had developed this quiet skill of reading me without having to ask questions. And so it didn't take him long to figure out that something had shaken me. I hadn't told him much about my past, just a few vague admissions during late-night conversations, like how I never went home for the holidays, or how my family thought my degree was a waste of time. But after the surprise appearance in the lobby, he sat me down, brought me tea without a word, and waited until I finally cracked open the lid on the whole, messy truth. I told him about the missed graduations, the birthday parties that became afterthoughts, the ways I had learned to make myself smaller, so Rebecca could shine uninterrupted. I told him about the dance recital lie, the burner phones, the shoebox of letters, the carefully orchestrated silence that had become both armor and prison. He didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. When I finally finished, when I was out of breath and out of rage, he just said, "You should talk to them. Not for them, for you." And I hated how much sense that made. Hated how much of me still wanted that final moment. That clean break where the truth is said aloud, in front of the people who had always dodged it, always twisted it into something palatable. So I called them, not with tears, not with anger, just a calm, neutral voice and a proposition. One conversation, one time, in a place I chose, with nothing expected and nothing guaranteed. My mother's voice cracked when she agreed. My father stayed quiet in the background. And a few days later, we met in a quiet diner near the city park. One of those retro-style places with laminated menus and red leather booths that smell faintly of maple syrup even at night. I arrived early and sat with my back to the door, because I didn't want the moment of seeing them walk in to be something I had to brace for. When they did sit down, opposite me with hands folded tightly on the table, I saw the wear in their faces, lines I hadn't noticed before, the subtle ways grief and time wear away at people. They didn't speak first, and I didn't rush to fill the space. Instead, I pulled out a single piece of paper, one I had written the night before, filled with bullet points like it was a meeting agenda. Because I knew myself well enough to understand that if I let the emotions take over, I'd either shut down or lash out, and neither would give me the peace I needed. I read the list aloud, slowly, each point its own little wound, the birthdays they forgot, the awards they never showed up for, the way every milestone in my life had been treated like a scheduling conflict. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't cry, I just spoke, clearly and without apology, until I reached the end and folded the paper neatly in half. My mother's hands were shaking. My father was staring down at the table like it might crack open and swallow him whole. She started to speak, something about how they didn't realize, how they never meant for it to feel like that. But I held up a hand, not to silence her out of cruelty, but because I had already anticipated those words. And they didn't carry any weight anymore. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a photograph, one that had been taken the week before at a company happy hour, where Jonah had snapped a candid shot of me laughing with my team, genuinely smiling in a way I hadn't even known I was capable of until I saw it in print. I slid it across the table to them and said, "This is my family now." They didn't understand it right away, not the full meaning, not the depth of what I was really saying. And that was fine, because it wasn't for them to understand, it was for me to say. They looked at the photo, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and heartbreak. And then my mother whispered, almost to herself, "But she's your sister." And I nodded, slowly, evenly, and replied, "And I was your daughter." There was nothing left after that. No fight, no final plea, just the echo of what should have been, sitting heavily between us like a third person in the booth. I stood up, paid for my coffee, and left without looking back, because I knew if I stayed, they'd try to make it about Rebecca again, try to pivot the conversation into some mutual mourning we hadn't earned. But I wasn't going to share their grief, not when they had never shared mine. Weeks passed. I blocked their numbers again. I deleted the voicemail my father left, something about regrets and time and how they do things differently now. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. That was no longer my concern. The life I was building in Denver wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and it was honest, and it was finally free of the weight of waiting for people to become what they'd never been. I went to work. I let Jonah hold my hand without pulling away. I walked through the park on Sundays and fed ducks near the water like some kind of old soul who had found her peace. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I wonder if Rebecca knows what happened, if she remembers that weekend, if she pieced together the lie, if she resents me for not showing up when she was hurt. But then I remind myself that this isn't a story where everyone gets redemption, where apologies fix everything, and where love is symmetrical. This is a story about learning that sometimes you don't get closure from the people who hurt you. You get it by walking away and meaning it. And maybe, just maybe, never looking back.